I want you to imagine something with me. It's evening. You're small. Maybe you're in bed. Maybe on the couch. There's a lamp on somewhere. The room feels warm. Someone opens a book and says, Once upon a time. And immediately, setting shifts. You don't know what's coming, but you know the rules are different now. Animals might talk, forests might swallow people whole. A girl might sleep for 100 years. A prince might turn into a beast. A stepmother might not be entirely trustworthy. And at the time, it feels simple. But if you go back, if you read those stories as an adult, something strange happens. They are not simple. They are violent, they are symbolic. They are full of hunger, jealousy, desire, death, and transformation. So tonight, I want you to sit with fairy tales, not as cute children's stories, but as something much older, stranger, and more powerful. Because fairy tales were never just for children. We use the word fairy tale casually now. We call romanticized story a fairy tale. But technically speaking, a fairy tale is a narrative born from oral tradition. It is usually short, it contains magical elements, it moves quickly, and interestingly, it doesn't necessarily have a moral. That is important. We often confuse fairy tales with fables. Fables teach. They end with a clear lesson. Fairy tales don't always do that. Sometimes good people suffer, sometimes cruel characters survive longer than they should, sometimes the resolution isn't moral, it's structural. The story restores balance, that's the goal. And when scholars started looking closely at fairy tales, they noticed something fascinating. The Russian folklorist Vladimir Propp studied hundreds of folk tales and realized that beneath all the different characters and settings, the same narrative patterns kept appearing. Different heroes, same functions. Someone leaves home, a prohibition is given, the rule is broken. A villain intervenes, a magical helper appears, a test is passed. It's almost mathematical. Fairy tales feel chaotic, but structurally, they are incredibly precise. And yet, structure alone doesn't explain why these stories exist in so many cultures with such similar patterns. For that, we have to move into anthropology. There's always been a debate. What's the difference between a myth and a fairy tale? The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that myths are sacred narratives, stories once believed to be true. Fairy tales, on the other hand, are fictional. They are told as invention. But here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes myths lose their sacred status over time. When it happens, they don't disappear. They transform. They become fairy tales. The structure survives, but the belief changes. So a story that once explained the seasons, or fertility, or cosmic order, becomes a narrative about a persecuted princess or a sleeping king. What we call fantasy may actually be cultural memory. Many fairy tales preserve traces of ancient initiation rituals, separation from family, trials in the wilderness, symbolic death, rebirth into maturity. When a young protagonist leaves home and faces danger, it's not random. It echoes real rites of passage, which makes fairy tales much less whimsical and much more anthropological. Another fascinating thing about fairy tales is how stable their symbols are. Name change, setting shift, violence gets softened or intensified depending on the era, but certain images persist. White, red, black. Snow, blood, and raven hair. These colors appear again and again in European storytelling, not as decoration but as symbolic code. Fairy tales don't explain their symbols. They assume recognition. They operate almost like dreams, emotionally legible, even when they aren't logically explained, which is exactly why psychology became so interested in them. In the 20th century, the psychologist Bruno Bettelheim brought the uses of enchantment, arguing that fairy tales help children process unconscious fears. The evil stepmother, for example, isn't necessarily about maternal cruelty. It can represent a child's internal conflict, splitting the idea of mother into nurturing and frustrating aspects. Sleeping for 100 years, that can symbolize suspended development, refusing to laugh, emotional immaturity, being offered food by a strange figure after crossing into a forest, a symbolic threshold, moving from the ordinary world into something transformative. Fairy tales make unbearable emotions narratively manageable. They don't describe anxiety, they dramatized it. And one of the most curious things about traditional fairy tales is how they treat trauma. Terrible things happen, abandonment, curses, betrayal, but the narrative doesn't dwell on psychological damage. The protagonist moves forward. Fairy tales operate in symbolic time, not therapeutic time. They are not concerned with realism, they are concerned with transformation. When we think about fairy tales, we often think about the Grimm's brothers. But long before them, in the 17th century Naples, there was Giambattista Basile, who wrote Lo Conto dei Conti, later known as the Pentamerone. And it was absolutely not written for children. It was written for adults at court. It contains satire, grotesque humor, sexual metaphors, political commentary. His frame story includes a princess who never laughs, a curse that requires filling a vessel with tears, a sleeping prince, a black servant who steals another woman's identity, 10 physically grotesque storytellers whose visible flaws symbolize the impossibility of hiding truth. It's theatrical and cynical and deeply aware that human beings are inconsistent and flawed. Later collectors like Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm believed they were preserving authentic oral tales, but even they edited and reshaped the stories. There is no pure fairy tale. Every version reflects the anxieties and values of its time. If fairy tales are violent, symbolic, structurally rigid, psychologically charged, why are they still here? Because they rehearse growth. Almost every fairy tale followed the same deep movement. Live, face danger, receive help, transform, return, or create a new order. That's not medieval. That's human. And maybe that's why we keep returning to them, even as adults. Through fantasy novels, through films, through retellings. They offer a symbolic map of becoming. Not neat, not always kind, but purposeful. So maybe the next time we hear Once Upon a Time, we can hear it differently. Not as a children's formula, but as the opening of something ancient. A structure that survived centuries. A container for fear, desire, jealousy, hope. A way of practicing transformation before we even knew we were practicing it. Fairy tales were never just stories. They were, and maybe still are, rehearsal for being human. If you listened until now, hi, I'm Helly, and a late welcome to the Bookish Key. This is a space where we talk about books as experiences, not just what we read, but how reading feels in our everyday lives. And this was the first of the many to come educational episodes that I hope to bring you in this podcast. Fairy tales always played a really important role in my life, and after studying them at university in a course of children's literature, I really wanted to share this fascinating world that fairy tales are. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And let me know what was your favorite fairy tale when you were a child. Or maybe the one that still lives rent-free in your heart. I would love to talk with you. Thank you for listening. Until next time, breathe gently.